In the forgotten corners of the Carpathian Mountains, where the clouds weep ash instead of rain, and time coils like mist around crumbling stones, there lies a land older than death itself. It is a place where history bleeds into myth, and the soil remembers every footstep, every sin, every scream. Here, among the twisted roots of blackened forests and the breathless silence of ruined monasteries, a name echoes through the centuries: Dracula. But not the Dracula you think you know. Before the novels, before the films, before the fangs and capes and candlelit castles turned to cliches, there was a story, a true story, one stitched together with blood and sorrow, shaped by war and legend, by grief and genius. This is not just the tale of a monster. This is the tale of two men, one born from flesh, the other from ink. One wielded a sword, the other a pen. One thirsted for vengeance, the other for immortality. And both, in their own cursed ways, found what they were looking for. Let us begin where every legend does, at the root, at the soil. Imagine a night so dark it feels alive, where wolves do not howl, but whisper secrets to the trees. The mountains are cloaked in storm clouds, and far below, a crooked village clings to a ravine like a memory refusing to die. Smoke rises from stone chimneys, mingling with the scent of iron, incense, and rot. In the chapel, prayers are whispered not to God, but to whatever shadow listens beyond the veil. This is Wallachia, not just a region, but a wound in the earth. For centuries, it has been a battlefield of empires. The Ottomans to the south, the Hungarians to the north, and in between, a people crushed, betrayed, and hardened by suffering. Kings come and go, borders shift like ghosts, but one truth remains: blood rules here. And it is in this land that Vlad III was born. A prince, a prisoner, a warrior, a monster, the man who would become known as Vlad the Impaler, and later, Dracula. But the path from prince to predator is not carved in a day, nor is the transformation from man to myth the work of swords alone. Centuries later, in the smoky heart of Victorian London, another man wrestled with shadows. This time not on a battlefield, but on parchment. Bram Stoker, a quiet, overworked theater manager, tormented by illness, obscurity, and unspoken desires, began to write. And what he wrote changed everything. The figure that emerged from Stoker's ink was no mere warlord. He was eternal, a predator of the soul, a shapeshifter, a symbol. Dracula became not just a villain, but an idea, the embodiment of forbidden lust, immortal fear, and the hunger we dare not name. But how did Stoker, an Irishman with no Romanian blood, uncover this ancient name from the depths of Eastern European history? Was it coincidence? Or did something draw him? Did the story find him? In the space between Vlad and Stoker, between history and imagination, there is a silence not of peace, but of potential, something brooding, waiting to be awakened. In this silence, we begin our descent. You must forget what you think you know. The costumes, the Halloween masks, the movie monsters. Those are shadows of shadows, reflections in bloodied glass. What we're about to uncover is far older, more human, more horrifying. This is the saga of a boy betrayed by his own kin, of a father who made a pact with darkness, of a writer haunted by dreams he could not explain, and of a myth that would swallow them both. You may feel, as we walk further into this tale, that something is watching. That's not imagination. It's memory. Because stories like this don't die, they sleep. And when they are remembered, when someone dares to speak them again, they stir. So let this be your first trial, to listen, not with ears, but with instinct. To feel the dread gathering in your spine not as fear, but as recognition. We have all met Dracula, in a dream, in a mirror, in the darkest part of ourselves. Now, picture a castle, not the glamorous ruins you've seen on postcards. This one breathes. Its stones sweat, its walls whisper, and in its highest tower sits a man, his armor rusted, his eyes sharp as blades, his soul eaten hollow by betrayal. Down the hall, another door opens, this one in a gas-lit London flat, where a man with sunken eyes dips his quill and begins to write. I am Dracula. But who is he really? A tyrant? A demon? A reflection of the man who created him? We are about to find out. Before he was a legend, he was a boy. And before he drank the blood of others, he tasted the bitterness of betrayal. Vlad was born in 1431, not in a castle veiled in thunderclouds, but in the shadow of war. His father, Vlad II Dracul, bore the title of Dracul, the Dragon, after being inducted into the secretive Order of the Dragon, a brotherhood sworn to defend Christendom against the Muslim Ottoman Empire. To a child, that meant nothing, but to the world, it meant everything. Vlad's early years were spent behind stone walls, learning to read, to ride, to kneel in prayer. But even then, he was not naive, not safe. His home was Wallachia, a land carved between enemies. The Ottoman Empire threatened from the south. The Kingdom of Hungary loomed from the north. And at home, treachery simmered in the court like poison in wine. And so, the boy prince was taught to watch, to mistrust, to listen not just to words, but to silence. His father ruled with calculation, with shifting allegiances. When convenient, he bent the knee to the Ottomans. When pressured, he turned back to Hungary. But such games demanded a price. In 1442, as a gesture of loyalty, Vlad II sent his sons, Vlad and Radu, as hostages to the Ottoman court. Imagine, a boy of 11, torn from his homeland, from the misty mountains of Wallachia, and delivered to the lavish, foreign world of Edirne. Turkish gardens, strange tongues, and golden crescents gleaming where crosses once stood. To survive, he learned quickly. To adapt. To watch even more closely. Radu, beautiful, charming, beloved, flourished. He earned the favor of the Sultan, even converted to Islam. But Vlad, he bristled. He endured beatings. He stared down princes and soldiers with the fire of a dragon's air. Here, in captivity, the monster was born, not with teeth, but with silence, with cold fury, with a hunger for control. And when news reached him that his father had been betrayed and murdered by Wallachian boyars, those noblemen who swore fealty by day and whispered murder by night, something inside Vlad hardened into steel. He would return, not as a boy, but as vengeance. 400 years later, in the gray churn of Victorian London, another child wrestled with silence. Abraham Bram Stoker was born in Dublin in 1847, during the black haze of the Irish famine. Sickly and bedridden for much of his early childhood, he lay in a quiet room while the world outside crumbled into poverty and madness. His mother, Charlotte, a gifted storyteller, told him tales of plague, death, and resilience. Stories not meant for children, but for survivors. Those stories never left him. By the time he walked again, he carried something inside him, a shadow, a fascination with death and the uncanny. But he wore it behind a polite mask. He studied mathematics and law, became a civil servant, married a beautiful actress, and found his way into London's literary and theatrical elite. Yet behind the curtain, his soul ached. He was a man possessed. He worked under the magnetic actor Henry Irving, managing London's Lyceum Theatre. Irving was brilliant, but cruel, theatrical, but manipulative. Their relationship was part devotion, part torment. Bram idolized him, some say loved him. Irving, in return, used him. By day, Bram worked tirelessly behind the scenes. By night, he wrote letters, diaries, then novels. And one day, after years of gathering folklore, researching Eastern Europe, and dreaming of dark castles and predatory eyes, he began to write something else entirely. Count Wamper. A few drafts later, the name changed. Dracula. For Vlad, the call to adventure came not from fate, but from fury. Released from Ottoman custody, he returned to Wallachia not as a supplicant, but as a predator in waiting. The throne was contested. The nobles who murdered his father still feasted. And so, Vlad claimed his place with a blade. In 1456, he ascended as voivode of Wallachia. His reign was brief, brutal, and unforgettable. He summoned the boyars who betrayed his family, feasted with them, then impaled them on stakes outside the capital. Forests of corpses, messages written not in ink, but in suffering. To some, he was a savior. To others, a devil. But to Vlad, it was justice. A world ruled by chaos must be tamed by terror. His methods were precise, strategic, symbolic. He impaled enemies not just to kill them, but to transform them into warnings, into monuments, into silence. He fought the Ottomans. He rebuilt fortresses. He ruled with such terrifying order that crime virtually vanished. But fear is a fragile throne. The more brutal he became, the more isolated he became. His brother Radu, now loyal to the Sultan, returned with an Ottoman army. Vlad was captured, imprisoned, forgotten, but not forever. As Bram wrote, strange things began to happen. He recorded in his notes that the idea for Dracula came to him in a dream, after a particularly heavy meal of crab. But perhaps it was something more. He began to obsess. He read dozens of books on Transylvania, on folklore, on blood rites, on the dead who do not die. He found the name Dracula in a dusty history volume, translated loosely as the son of the dragon or son of the devil. That ambiguity fascinated him. What truly drew him to Vlad's legacy? Was it merely exotic inspiration? Or did something darker call to him from across centuries? Some scholars believe Dracula is a vessel, a reflection of Stoker's subconscious, his fear of disease, of sexuality, of domination, of unspoken desire. Others believe something else, that Dracula was not created by Bram, but that Bram was chosen. A man sickly in childhood, obsessed with death, abused by power, longing to immortalize himself. And what better vessel than a creature who defies death itself? Stoker didn't just create Dracula. He became him, through ink and illness, through obsession and sacrifice. Vlad and Bram, two men, centuries apart, one born into blood, one born into shadow, both consumed by control. Vlad wanted to control his world through fear, through impalement, through legend. He turned cruelty into legacy. Bram wanted to control death through fiction, through myth, through ink. He turned fear into immortality. Neither man died cleanly. Vlad was said to be decapitated, his head sent to the Sultan, his body buried in secret. Bram died weakened and obscure, forgotten by fame, overshadowed by the very monster he birthed. But both left behind something that refused to die. Let us pause. Look closer. What makes a monster? Is it the act of cruelty? The thirst for power? Or is it the quiet decision to forsake one's humanity to survive? For Vlad, the transformation was gradual but undeniable. Once a hostage, then a prince, then a butcher of his enemies. But beneath every impalement, every decree, there was the echo of a child's scream, alone in a foreign court, watching his younger brother thrive under the very empire that enslaved them. Somewhere in him, love curdled into rage, mercy into message. He did not enjoy cruelty for cruelty's sake. He wielded it as a weapon, as a performance. His legend became his armor. The more monstrous the myth, the safer his power. But what he could not escape was this: to become feared by all is to belong to no one. He ruled a kingdom of silence. And in that silence, even the strongest man begins to fade. For Stoker, the monster was subtler, quieter, but no less hungry. He wrote of a being that enters homes uninvited, drains you while you sleep, seduces and infects, and leaves you changed. A creature that does not simply kill you, it rewrites you. That's the story he told. But beneath it, Bram himself was surrounded by unspoken horrors. Victorian London was a city obsessed with purity and repression, of emotion, of sexuality, of desire. Homosexuality was criminalized. Illness was hidden. Power was preserved through silence. And in that silence, Bram began to write about a man who breaks all rules. Dracula crosses boundaries between life and death, man and beast, foreigner and native, male and female. He is everything repressed, everything feared, and perhaps everything desired. Bram gave the world a monster. But in doing so, he gave himself freedom, through fiction, through metaphor, through myth. And like Vlad, he too was consumed by the very thing he created. If you placed their lives side by side, you'd see strange reflections. Vlad, born into violence, fought to seize power and make his name eternal. Bram, born into obscurity, sought to immortalize others, and in doing so, etched his own name into legend. Vlad's castle was real, perched on the cliffs of Wallachia, its stones soaked in wind and blood. Bram's castle was imagined, yet more enduring, its blue-lit towers now etched into the minds of millions. Vlad wanted to control the world through fear. Bram wanted to understand the world through stories. And yet, both left behind the same immortal shadow. Dracula. Every great myth is born from a wound. Achilles had his heel. Oedipus had his prophecy. Dracula has his thirst. And both Vlad and Bram carried wounds that shaped their destinies. Vlad's wound was betrayal. By family, by nation, by God himself, some might say. It festered into rage, into strategy, into performance. He didn't just become a ruler, he became a symbol, a warning to those who dared to wound him again. Bram's wound was invisibility, a child left in bed, a man in the shadow of greater names, a writer whose work was rarely recognized in his lifetime. And so, he stitched his soul into a creature too powerful to be ignored. These wounds bled into history, and like all true myths, they infected others. There is an old belief in Eastern European folklore that certain names are not invented. They are discovered. Dracula is one of those names. Whether carved in wood, etched in blood, or scribbled in a trembling hand at midnight, once written, it is awake. A symbol, a hunger. Vlad gave it flesh. Bram gave it form. We keep it alive. But every story has a cost. And those who carry it forward must understand that they are not simply telling a tale. They are summoning something ancient. Summary of what we've unveiled. We met Vlad III, shaped by cruelty, betrayal, and political chaos, and watched him transform into a ruler who would wield terror like a sword. We uncovered Bram Stoker, a quiet, sickly man who encoded his obsessions and repression into a myth that has outlived empires. And we saw how both men, despite their distance in time, were linked by shadow, by hunger, and by their shared creation. Next, we venture into darkness does not fall all at once. It drips like candle wax on cold stone, one shadow at a time, one silence deeper than the last. And so begins the descent of both Vlad the man and Bram the writer into the haunted corridors of their fate, not with howls or lightning, but with a whisper. There is no going back now. The throne of Wallachia was not a seat. It was a stake, and Vlad III, once returned, found that to rule a land soaked in treachery, one must become treachery itself. In the early days of his rule, Vlad rode out like a tempest. He was no longer the prince betrayed. He was the dragon reborn. His enemies were many, foreign and domestic. The boyars, fat with stolen power, had danced on the graves of his family. Now, he invited them to a feast. The story goes that he welcomed them with wine, meat, music, and smiles. Then he had them seized. Some were impaled where they stood. Others were forced to march, barefoot and starving, to rebuild his ruined fortress at Poenary, high in the cliffs. Few survived. Those who did were no longer noble, only broken. His message was clear: loyalty or the stake. But power earned through fear is never safe. The people whispered in awe and terror. The nobles plotted in silence. And the Sultan to the south began to watch. Vlad knew he was surrounded, knew that every banquet, every alliance, every whisper in the wind might hide a dagger. So he struck first. The most infamous of Vlad's horrors was not a single act, but a vision, a tableau of warning. In 1462, the Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, marched into Wallachia with a massive army to crush the defiant voivode. But as his troops advanced through the valleys, they found something waiting. Not armies, not walls, a forest, but not of trees, of corpses. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers, merchants, and spies, captured, skewered, and left to rot on stakes. Some upright, some bent, some impaled through the chest, others from groin to mouth. The sky was thick with birds and the stench of death. The Sultan looked upon it and said nothing. Then he turned back. What kind of man halts an empire with terror? What kind of man plants death like a garden? Vlad had won, but victories built on fear do not last. Within months, the boyars conspired once more, this time with his own brother, Radu, backed by the Ottomans. Vlad's armies were betrayed, his allies fled, and he was captured, not killed, imprisoned, for 12 years. While Vlad built forests of death, Bram built castles of shadow, brick by brick, sentence by sentence. By the late 1880s, Dracula was consuming him. He buried himself in maps of Transylvania, railway schedules, archaic rituals, burial customs. He wrote in the margins of obscure folklore books. He scrawled letters to friends asking for translations of old Eastern European names. He scribbled in notebooks late at night, sometimes in near-manic bursts. And the story began to grow teeth. Dracula was not just a villain. He was immortal decay, the disease of empire, the foreign invader, the aristocrat who feeds on the poor, the seductive destroyer of women, the father of all hunger. But where was Bram in all this? Behind the ink, his own life was fraying. He toiled at the Lyceum, endlessly trying to please Irving. His marriage had grown cold. His wife, Florence, had once been courted by Oscar Wilde, and their passion had dulled into distant routine. His health declined. His eyes burned. His hands trembled. Yet he could not stop writing. It was as if the story had possessed him, and perhaps that had. It is said that Stoker often dreamed of Dracula, standing at the foot of his bed, watching, waiting. In one journal entry, he describes a nightmare of a pale man whispering through the darkness, "You are mine now. You have summoned me." Was it a metaphor? Or something deeper? Victorian occult societies, which fascinated both Stoker and his peers, believed that certain names and symbols held real power, that writing them down was an act of invocation. To name is to call. To describe is to shape. And Bram had named something, described something, given it form. Perhaps what Vlad had forged through flesh, Bram had now revived through language. And Dracula, the legend, the idea, the entity, was no longer chained to history. It was becoming eternal. Released from captivity in the late 1470s, Vlad clawed his way back to power one last time. The throne of Wallachia was a corpse he refused to stop resurrecting. He marched with Hungarian aid, cut through enemy lines, reclaimed his kingdom once again. But it was not the same. The fear that once made him untouchable now isolated him. The nobility despised him. His brother was dead, but his enemies had multiplied. In December 1476, just weeks after reclaiming his crown, Vlad disappeared in battle. Some say he was ambushed and killed by his own men. Others claim he was beheaded by Ottoman forces. Still others whisper he vanished into the mountains, never found, never buried. His severed head, it is said, was delivered to the Sultan in Constantinople. But the body? Gone. No grave, no marker, only the myth. In 1897, Dracula was finally published. It was not an immediate success. Critics were intrigued. Sales were modest. Stoker, already fading in health, never lived to see the impact his monster would have on the world. He died in 1912, weakened by strokes, rumored to have suffered from syphilis, a disease that eats the mind before the flesh. He died poor, forgotten, but not his creation. Within a decade, Dracula had risen again, first in plays, then on film. The vampire would wear many faces, Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee, Gary Oldman, but the soul remained the same. A hunger wrapped in elegance, a prince of shadows, a myth that outlives its makers. And Bram? He had joined Vlad, buried in obscurity, while their child ruled the dreams of the world. The snow fell thicker now. Each flake that touched the earth inched Jonathan Harker deeper into the cold shadow of the past, not merely the Count's, but humanity's, as though the Carpathian Mountains were not mountains at all, but ancient thoughts rising through the crust of time. He wandered through the remnants of a village, broken wooden gates, roofs caved in by age, and iron crosses twisted by storms. Not a soul lived here now, yet there was a feeling, like breath lingering on a mirror. Something had happened, and not long ago. Harker could smell it in the rot beneath the snowfall, in the way the crows circled without cawing, in the unnatural stillness that clung to the abandoned chapel that stood crooked at the edge of the ruins. Inside that chapel, he discovered the legacy of Dracula was far darker than even his writings implied. Drop of blood, the forgotten child in the chapel's crypt, beneath a shattered floor tile. Harker uncovered a stone tablet. On it was a carved name, worn nearly illegible, Vladisla. The rest was lost. But the iconography beside it, an impaled lamb, a weeping sun, a crown made of thorns, was unmistakable. It was not the Count's tomb, but that of a child born of blood, born of him. Not a rumor, not legend, but truth. A child Dracula never spoke of. And suddenly, the Count's cruelty, his obsessive need to conquer time, his haunting soliloquies about the loss of love and soul, they weren't just philosophical meditations. They were the remnants of fatherhood turned to ash. A vision overtook Jonathan then, not a dream, but something between memory and possession. In it, a younger Dracula walked the marble corridors of a Balkan fortress. Not yet the monster, not yet the immortal, Just Vlad, a warlord torn by the birth of his son, a child born of a woman he once loved, before war made love irrelevant. But the boy had been frail, feared by the clergy, whispered to be cursed by the devil himself. The villagers had begged Dracula to do what must be done, but he had refused, so they did it for him. One night, the boy disappeared. A small white robe left outside the fortress gates, bloodied and burned. Harker fell to his knees in the crypt. This was the Count's wound, the origin of his hatred for humanity, for God, for death. It was not the loss of love, but the murder of innocence. It was the first time Jonathan understood Dracula was not just a monster. He was a man trying to undo a murder time refused to heal. And now, he was building something. A place where time would obey him, where death would kneel, and he would never lose a child again. Later that evening, Harker followed a trail left in ancient stone markers, glyphs resembling veins, crawling toward the cliffs. There, hidden behind a veil of thorn-covered arches, lay the entrance to an underground city, or rather, the foundation of one. Carved beneath the mountains, it was half temple, half laboratory. Cold steel bled into Byzantine stonework. Alchemical instruments fused with Christian relics. Crucifixes dripped with mercury. Angels wore iron masks. And there they were, the tomb architects. Pale, hunched, faceless artisans, creatures of dust and oath. This was a resurrection machine, and it was nearly complete. Back in Vienna, Abraham Van Helsing read Harker's letter and immediately fell into a state of strange delirium. His hands trembled, his mouth filled with sand. He had seen these glyphs before, long ago, on the scrolls of the Order of the Black Rose, an excommunicated sect that believed God himself had a wand, and that men could climb into it. In a hidden archive beneath the University of Amsterdam, Van Helsing uncovered their doctrine. Where man dies, he forgets. Where vampire dies, he returns. But where both meet, in blood and thought, there, eternity finds form. Van Helsing understood. Dracula was not trying to cheat death. He was trying to sculpt eternity. But eternity could not be shared. It had to be owned, and only one soul would reign over it. Either Dracula, or whoever could sever the glyphs. As Harker journeyed deeper into the tomb city, he was not alone. A woman in a black veil followed him, always at a distance, never speaking, her footsteps silent, her silhouette blurry in the torchlight. She bore no shadow. She wept blood, and in every chamber where Dracula's child was once referenced, she had left a rose. Harker confronted her in a sanctum of mirrors, where no reflection worked, and every surface showed a different version of himself. "Who are you?" he asked. Her voice was wind. "I am the morning that became bone." And she handed him a locket. Inside, the image of a child. The same child from the chapel tomb. The same child Harker had seen in his vision. Only now, in the faintest of etchings, the boy wore Jonathan's face. Not entirely, but enough. Enough to make his blood freeze. He asked her, "Is this me?" She said only, "This is why he watches you." And then she vanished into the mirrors. The final chamber in this part of the tomb was shaped like a heart. Literally, not metaphorically. A giant, pulsing stone heart had been sculpted into the ceiling. With each slow thump, it exhaled dust and time. Here, Harker saw what Dracula had become, a man who no longer slept, who had trained himself to never dream, who had drained so many minds that he could remember not just his life, but others. He remembered alternate selves, alternate histories, lives he never lived, but which could have been. He saw himself not as one man, but as the possibility of many. And now he sought to crystallize the one he wanted. A life with his son, a world in which the child had lived. And if the real world refused it, then he would build a new one, even if it meant turning time into ash. Harker knelt before the pulsing heart, and he understood. He was not hunting Dracula. Dracula was testing him, studying him, perhaps preparing him for something monstrous or divine. It pulsed with silence, a silence that grew heavier with each stone corridor, as if absorbing the footsteps of those who dared walk its halls. In these depths, the walls wept moisture. The air was still, too still, as if even the shadows dared not breathe. Jonathan Harker, his coat now tattered and dust-covered, pressed forward through the ancient underground, holding a rusted candelabra he'd wrested from an abandoned altar above. The flame trembled, not from wind, but from dread. The path had become a labyrinth. No longer a castle, a living tomb. The passageways bent in unnatural curves. Some opened into caverns with walls of living flesh, pulsing veins running through the stone like tree roots. Others twisted into impossible geometry, where stairs led nowhere and doors vanished once shut. Jonathan marked the walls with his own blood, scratched lines with broken fingernails, but each time he circled back, the marks were gone. In one chamber, he encountered himself, or a version of himself, bound in chains, whispering warnings in a voice no longer quite human. He feeds on memory, on fear. You must forget who you are if you want to leave. But forgetting was the danger. Forgetting would make him one of them. Deep in the core of the labyrinth, Jonathan stumbled into a chapel sunken beneath the earth. Here, time stilled. Dust floated like stars in dark water. Stone pews faced an altar made not of wood, but of bone, each carved with the names of the lost. From the darkness above, a low hymn emerged. A choir, soft and chilling, sang a song without words. Figures began to materialize. Dozens, hundreds, all pale, all silent, all staring. The lost souls of the castle. Harker recognized some. The coachman who first brought him, the maid who once brought him bread, even Lucy, with her soft, angelic smile, lips bloodied, eyes hollow. They sang not to welcome him, but to warn. He stepped backward, then froze. Behind him, a voice. Even God would not follow you here. It was Van Helsing, or his ghost, seated at the altar like a high priest of ruin. But his face was wrong. Too calm, too knowing, not entirely alive. Jonathan, the creature said in Van Helsing's voice, you search for truth. But this place feeds on truth like marrow. With a slow wave, the walls of the chapel began to melt. Scenes from Harker's life poured into the space like liquid shadow. Mina weeping, alone in a room filled with shattered wedding china. Lucy in her white gown, bleeding from the throat. Dracula, kissing Jonathan's neck with affection, not malice. Is this who you are? The not Van Helsing whispered. A man of reason? A husband? A victim? Jonathan screamed, throwing the candelabra into the altar. The room exploded into cinders, then collapsed. Harker awoke in a stone chamber where mirrors lined the walls. Each reflected not him, but Dracula, sometimes as a prince, sometimes as a monster, sometimes as a man in agony. In all, lonely. Suddenly, the voice came again, but now, it was unmistakably his. You see me everywhere, because I am already inside you. From the mirrors stepped Dracula himself. But this time, not as predator, as tormentor, as mirror. The two men circled each other. Jonathan, breathing hard. Dracula, solemn. You think I cursed your life? Dracula said, voice soft. But I offered you escape. From the cage of society, the burden of love, the agony of time. Jonathan, you murdered the woman I love. Dracula's eyes softened. She loved what I awakened in her. He touched one of the mirrors. This is not a tomb, Jonathan. It's a chrysalis. At his gesture, the mirrors cracked, revealing not horrors but truths. Dracula, once a scholar in a forgotten monastery, weeping over a letter from a wife lost to plague. Dracula, on a battlefield, burying comrades who worshipped him as savior. Dracula, alone for centuries, speaking only to ghosts. And then, Dracula feeding, as if to silence the pain with blood. I was not born a monster, he whispered. I became one, so I could survive. Jonathan stared at him, not as a victim, not as a hero, but as a man. The castle began to rumble. I can free you, Dracula offered. Not through death, but through understanding. Take my place. Rule this labyrinth. Let go of your old life. Be reborn. Jonathan felt the castle breathe, like a beast behind a curtain. The walls closed in. He remembered Mina's voice. Her warmth. Her sorrow. Come back to me. And Dracula? He stepped back. Or stay. And never fear again. Jonathan looked into the last mirror. It showed him, older, colder, powerful. A vampire king, seated on a throne of silence. He shattered it with his fist. The castle screamed. Flames burst from the cracks. The souls in the chapel howled, not in pain, but release. Jonathan ran, not through halls, but through memory. Past Mina, past Lucy, past himself, until he collapsed at a crumbled doorway where moonlight, real, golden, warm, bled in through the cracks. He crawled toward it, weeping. Dracula stood behind him, silent. "I could have made you immortal," he whispered. Jonathan turned back. "You did." And with that, the castle of blood sealed itself behind him. The snow fell like silent confessions, burying the old sins of the land under a veil of forgetfulness. But beneath it, something stirred, ancient, crimson, and unrepentant. Jonathan stood before the ruined altar in the catacombs of Snagov, where the legend said Vlad once sought absolution but found only the echo of his own rage. The walls were slick with frost, but inscriptions still burned beneath them, blood-written, not carved. Symbols of pact, sacrifice, and eternal hunger. "Do you know why I chose this place?" came the voice, not from behind him, not from the dark, but from within him. Dracula, not as flesh, but as memory incarnate. A spectral force that had embedded itself deep into Jonathan's mind during the nights he'd spent in the castle. Ever since he'd crossed the Carpathian threshold, the line between host and invader had blurred. "Because confession is a fool's ritual," the voice continued. "And I was never a fool. I was abandoned, by my God, by my country, by love itself." The air thickened, and with it, the walls pulsed faintly, as if breathing with a forgotten heart. The chamber darkened, not from shadow, but from memory. Jonathan found himself standing not in the present, but transported, through sensation and hallucination, to the moment of Dracula's final transformation. He was in a chapel, shattered and aflame, the cross splintered, blood flooding the marble floor. And at the center of it, Vlad, not yet the monster, not yet the myth, but a man. Broken, betrayed, on his knees, cradling the lifeless body of Elizabeta. She had thrown herself from the tower upon hearing false news of his death. The priest said suicide damned her soul. The church refused her burial. God refused her salvation. And so Vlad refused God. "You taught me to defend Christendom, yet you defiled her name. You raised me as your sword, and then dulled me with grief. So I shall become what you fear. I shall become eternal. I shall drink the blood you waste in war. I shall wear your nightmares like a crown." A blade, a sacred one, was plunged into the altar. The blood from his hand mixed with the wine spilled in grief. The Eucharist became the blasphemy. And the earth, once consecrated, twisted. It wasn't a pact with Satan. It was something older. A rejection of duality. A unification of predator and priest. King and corpse. He stumbled backward into the present, retching, eyes wild. Mina caught him. She had followed him, though he had warned her not to. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked. "Not with eyes, but with the blood. It remembers." He nodded. He couldn't speak. His throat burned, not from cold, but from revelation. Mina stepped forward, touching the altar, and her body tensed. She didn't see Vlad's death. She saw his life. Not the tyrant. The child. The prisoner of the Ottomans. The betrayed husband. The man whose love had been declared a sin. And in that moment, she understood something terrifying. Dracula had not been born from evil. He had been sculpted from injustice. The curse wasn't that he drank blood. It was that he remembered too much. Behind the altar was a hidden vault, a room forbidden even to the monks who had served there centuries ago. Inside, they found it, a tome, bound in leather so old it had petrified into bone, written in a language not of any known root. A record of all the bloodlines Dracula had traced, tainted, or absorbed. Not names, feelings, memories sealed in glyphs. Mina touched one and gasped. A child abandoned in the snow. Another glyph, an old woman suffocated in a cellar. Another, a knight impaled not out of cruelty, but to silence his betrayal. Jonathan stared at the center page. It bore only one name, Elizabeta. Beneath it, a sentence scratched so deeply it tore the parchment. "She is the only thing I could not resurrect." At last, the truth emerged, not from whispered tales or Vatican records, but from Dracula's own buried confession. He had tried to bring her back, not through necromancy, not through sorcery, but through memory. He created women, dozens, hundreds, who looked like her, who spoke like her, who bled like her, but none of them were her. They were shadows, vessels, attempts at resurrection by obsession. Mina was the last, the most perfect, not because she looked like Elizabeta, but because her soul had touched something Dracula had once loved. And that's why he couldn't hurt her. That's why he spared her. That's why he haunted her. He didn't want to kill Mina. He wanted to be forgiven by her. The catacombs began to rumble. The past, now spoken aloud, was waking the land. But not in vengeance. In release. Dracula's grip was not immortal. It was emotional. He remained not because he was invincible, but because the world hadn't understood him, hadn't named the pain beneath the power. Now someone had. And that was the real exorcism. Mina took the tome and walked to the altar. She opened it to the final page and, with trembling hands, wrote one line. You were loved. As the ink soaked the parchment, the walls howled, not in rage, but in grief. The air shattered like glass. And then, silence. They emerged from the ruins into dawnlight. The snow was melting. The trees, long dead, had begun to bud. Mina didn't speak for a long time. Neither did Jonathan. Dracula had not been vanquished. He had been understood. And sometimes, that is the more powerful ending. But as they descended the mountain path, Mina stopped. Her hand brushed her neck. A scar. Still faint. Still present. Because memory doesn't vanish. It becomes the soil from which something else grows. The final confrontation began not with a sword raised, but with silence, unnatural and loud. Mina stood at the threshold of the crumbling castle chapel, her figure silhouetted by the moonlight pouring through stained glass ruins. Behind her, Van Helsing gripped a vial of sacred oil. Beside her, Jonathan's hand trembled on the hilt of his blade, worn from battles both physical and spiritual. Before them stood Dracula, not monstrous, but regal, not cloaked in shadow, but bathed in a sorrowful kind of light. He did not attack. He simply looked at Mina. You carry her voice, he whispered. Mina's brow furrowed. Whose? My Alira. Van Helsing hissed a curse beneath his breath, stepping forward, but Mina held him back. What do you mean? Dracula's voice was slow, old, as though speaking cost him centuries. When I was mortal, I loved once. A healer in my kingdom, a woman of light. When she was burned for sorcery during the plague, something in me shattered. The church called her a witch. I called her salvation. He looked up, and for the first time, Mina saw not fangs or fury, but a man buried under time. You are not her, he said. But the fire in your eyes, it is hers. Mina felt the weight of 1,000 lives pressing on her spine. It was not reincarnation she felt, but reflection. Some shadows don't vanish, they shift. Van Helsing stepped forward. He's stalling. We end this now. But Mina didn't move. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Why keep going, Dracula? Why spill more blood? Dracula turned. His voice echoed with bitterness. Because no god answered when she screamed. No heaven opened. So I became the thing that heaven feared. Lightning split the sky. Thunder rolled through the earth like divine judgment. And with that, the final battle began. Not between good and evil, but between the haunted and the broken. As Jonathan and Van Helsing fought Dracula's final guardians, shadow beasts crawling from the walls like oil come alive, Mina descended alone into the crypt beneath the chapel. Here, the original coffin lay, the one built by mortal hands centuries ago, untouched by decay. Carved into its surface, symbols not of evil, but of grief. Prayers in Old Church Slavonic. Names of those Dracula had lost. Mina's fingers traced the final name. Alira. She knelt, not to pray, but to speak. I see you now, not as a monster, but as a man who couldn't grieve. The coffin trembled. Dust whispered through the air like falling ash. I don't know if you can be saved, she said, but maybe you don't have to keep punishing the world for its silence. She opened her palm. A drop of her blood hit the wood, one final offering. And from above came a scream. The battle ended in silence. Van Helsing, wounded and bloodied, limped toward the altar, sword dripping red. Jonathan collapsed beside Mina, his hand reaching for hers as Dracula approached, slowly, like a man walking toward judgment. He looked at Mina, then at the sword Van Helsing raised. But he did not resist. Do it, Dracula said. Strike me down, priest. Isn't that why you followed me for 30 years? But Van Helsing hesitated, because what stood before him was not the beast he had hunted. It was the shell of vengeance, the hollow husk of history's sin. You deserve death, Van Helsing said, but not from hate. He placed the sword down. Mina approached Dracula, and this time, she raised the blade. Dracula smiled. Alira always believed in mercy, he said. Perhaps that is why I was cursed to live without her. And then he knelt. Mina drove the blade through his heart, not in rage, but reverence. Dracula did not scream. He exhaled, as if relieved. The castle burned, not from fire, but from time catching up. Walls collapsed as dawn finally broke. Real dawn, not hidden behind clouds or mist. As light crept into the crypts, the shadows disintegrated into dust, and Dracula's body crumbled in Mina's arms. Not grotesque, peaceful, a man forgiven. As the trio escaped through the collapsing halls, Van Helsing looked back one last time. "Do you think it's over?" Jonathan asked. Van Helsing didn't answer. Instead, he pulled from his coat an ancient scroll, one not of curses, but of names. He added a final entry. Vlad Tepes. Freed. Years passed. Mina wrote a book, not a tale of vampires, but of sorrow. Of how grief can consume empires. Of how men can become myths, and myths become prisons. Her book was not popular, but it was honest. Van Helsing disappeared, last seen walking into the Carpathians with a worn rosary and no sword. Some say he died in peace. Others say he met Elira's ghost. Jonathan and Mina stayed by the sea, raising a daughter they named Elira. Sometimes, when the fog rolls thick over the waves, Mina feels a presence in the wind. Not a monster, a man. And in her heart, she whispers, "Rest now, Prince of Shadows. Your war is over."